I knew the exact moment I became furniture in the office of OmniStream Technologies. It was not when they moved my desk next to the server closet to make room for a brand new ping pong table. And it was not when the newly hired director of corporate culture asked me if I was the technician who repaired the office printer. It was at the Series C celebration dinner, a lavish affair that cost more than my first year of salary. They were popping expensive French champagne like it was tap water, toasting to the visionary genius of OmniStream Technologies, while Gavin Fletcher, the visionary genius himself, stood on a mahogany table soaking wet with alcohol, screaming about how he had single-handedly changed the world. I was sitting at the far end of the long table, nursing a lukewarm seltzers, watching them celebrate a machine they did not know how to turn on. People think technology startups are built on dreams, passion, and caffeine. They are not. They are built on stacks of paperwork that nobody reads, because everyone is too busy measuring the size of their own egos in the reflection of a glass skyscraper. Before all this madness, I spent 20 years working as a software engineer at various corporations, watching younger managers take credit for my systems while I received cost of living adjustments and empty pats on the back. I got tired of the corporate ladder, of the endless meetings that resolved nothing, and of the feeling of being completely disposable. 8 years ago, before the sleek glass offices, the catering, and the expensive designer fleece vests, it was just me and a laptop in a damp basement that smelled of wet drywall and desperate ambition. The basement belonged to Gavin's uncle, and the radiator made a clanking noise like a dying steam engine every time the temperature dropped. I wrote the core engine, the predictive commerce system that currently generates 90% of this company's revenue. Gavin Fletcher provided the cheap pizza and the marketing hype. I provided the mathematical logic. I was a 53-year-old software engineer with a mortgage, student loans that looked like international telephone numbers, and a lifetime of trust issues. I did not want equity that could be diluted into nothing by greedy venture capitalists who knew how to play the game better than I did. I wanted absolute control. So, when we were incorporating the business, I slipped a single, boring document into the middle of the massive stack of incorporation papers, right between the corporate bylaws and the standard non-compete agreements. It was an intellectual property lease agreement. It stated in very plain, dry legal English that I, Clifford Vance, retained full ownership of the predictive logic source code, version 1.0, and all subsequent derivatives. The document stated that I was leasing this engine to OmniStream Technologies for the generous sum of $1 per year. The lease was renewable annually and could be terminated by the licensor, which was me, with 30 days of written notice if the lease fee was not paid or if the contract was not formally renewed by both parties. Gavin Fletcher signed it. He signed it with a massive flourish, using a fountain pen he could not afford, all while talking about disrupting the global paradigm. He did not read it. Nobody read it. For 8 years, I paid myself that $1 out of the petty cash drawer, filed the paper receipt in a secure folder, and renewed the lease unilaterally. I was the ghost in the machine. I kept the database running, patched the memory leaks, and scaled the entire architecture, while Gavin went on podcasts and talked about synergy and innovation. But the corporate atmosphere shifted about 6 months ago. The company grew too big for its boots, transitioning into what the venture capitalists called operational maturity. The developer culture went from charmingly chaotic to toxic and sterile. I stopped being treated as the founding engineer and started being viewed as a legacy liability. I was not hip. I did not play golf with the board. I did not want to consume microdoses of psychedelics at executive retreats in the desert. I just wanted to write clean, high-performance code. I sat at that celebration dinner, watching Gavin high-five the new vice president of sales, a young man who looked like he had been grown in a laboratory that specialized in teeth whitening and unearned confidence. In that moment, a cold calm settled over me. They looked at the quiet older man in the gray cardigan and saw an antique. They did not realize they were looking at their landlord, and the rent was about to go up. The disconnect was almost comical. They were celebrating the harvest, completely unaware that I owned the trees, the soil beneath them, and the water rights to the valley. I went back to the office late that night. I did not go to work on code, but to inspect the physical filing cabinet in the basement archive. There it was, yellowing slightly at the edges, the original lease agreement containing Gavin Fletcher's jagged signature in dark blue ink. I made a high-resolution digital copy and stored it on an encrypted drive. Then I printed 3 physical copies and locked them in my home safe. I went home, poured myself a glass of aged single malt scotch and waited. I knew the storm was coming. I just did not expect it to arrive wearing designer sneakers and a fake smile named Gerald Thorne, the man who was about to try to destroy my career. Gerald Thorne was the newly appointed director of engineering, brought in by the board of directors because they believed the company needed executive polish, structured leadership, and modern operational methodologies. Gerald was the exact type of manager who used words like ideate, North Star, and scalable synergy in every single casual conversation. His online profile was a barren wasteland of buzzwords, but he possessed an expensive business degree from a prestigious university and an uncanny ability to take credit for other people's labor. He had previously worked at another startup that went completely under within 18 months, but he had somehow managed to spin that failure as an invaluable learning opportunity. He walked into the engineering department on his first day, clapped his hands together with fake enthusiasm, and announced that we were going to pivot to a microservices architecture driven by artificial intelligence native frameworks. I felt a familiar migraine forming behind my left eye. The current system was already running on a highly optimized, custom microservices framework that I had spent 3 years perfecting. But men like Gerald do not actually look at code or understand system performance. They look at colorful slides, buzzword charts, and complicated architectural diagrams. In his first all-hands meeting, Gerald presented a 50-slide deck filled with abstract shapes and arrows, pointing toward a digital cloud. The junior developers, eager to please, nodded their heads in rhythmic synchronization, pretending to understand the complex network of buzzwords. Gerald talked about breaking down silos and establishing a culture of high operational velocity. I sat in the back of the room, looking at the technical blueprints on the screen, realizing that his proposed architecture would introduce massive latency and double our cloud hosting costs. When I raised my hand and pointed out the potential performance bottlenecks, Gerald smiled patronizingly and told me that we needed to look at the big picture rather than getting bogged down in implementation details. It was clear that he viewed actual software engineering as a minor utility, a simple task that could be automated or outsourced. He called me into his office on Tuesday afternoon. His office was one of those glass fish bowls in the center of the engineering floor, where the entire department could watch you getting demoted or fired. He did not offer me a seat. Instead, he sat on the edge of his mahogany desk, swinging his leg back and forth in a manner designed to project a mixture of casual warmth and corporate authority. He told me that I had done great work on the legacy systems during the early days, but they were bringing in a new team of developers to build the next generation of the platform. He said they needed younger energy and fresh eyes to take the company to the next level. He told me the board wanted me to transition into an advisory role, specifically as the head of legacy maintenance. It was corporate speak for a janitor. He wanted me to write down all my tribal knowledge, hand over the administrative keys to the servers, and then sit quietly in a corner until they could find a legal way to eliminate my position entirely. I looked at him calmly. I looked at his perfectly styled hair, his expensive designer sweater, and his luxury watch that cost more than my first house. He thought he was putting the old horse out to pasture. He had no idea he was talking to the man who owned the pasture, the barn, and the water supply. I told him I understood his perspective and that I would prepare the documentation and organize the server keys. He beamed, calling me a team player and telling me to make sure the new engineers had root access to the database by Friday. He thought he had successfully managed a difficult transition with a legacy employee. I walked out of his office, feeling more alive than I had in years. It is the feeling a seasoned poker player gets when they hold a royal flush and the opponent raises the stakes by putting their house keys on the table. I went back to my desk and began my work. But I was not writing programming tutorials or system guides. I was performing a detailed audit of the company's files. I pulled the system logs for the last 8 years and downloaded the commit histories. I documented every single instance where Gavin, Gerald, or the company's lawyers had claimed my code was the proprietary property of OmniStream Technologies in communications with investors and clients. I built a comprehensive dossier of their lies. Then I checked the calendar. The annual lease renewal for the core engine was due on the 1st of October. It was now the 15th of October. They had missed the renewal deadline completely. They had also failed to pay the $1 fee. According to the contract, the lease had terminated. For 2 weeks, OmniStream Technologies had been operating their entire business using unlicensed intellectual property. I said nothing. I kept working and smiling at the junior developers who looked at me with pity, thinking I was just another old engineer fading away. I spent hours verifying the lease details. The contract was signed in black ink, and my wife, Eleanor, had recorded the document properly when we incorporated the business. I knew that Gavin's team had never reviewed the original incorporation documents during their venture funding rounds. They had simply signed the standard representations and warranties, assuming everything was clean. This was the classic arrogance of fast-growing startups. They move fast and break things, but sometimes they break the very foundation they are standing on. I quietly saved the logs, closed my laptop, and walked out of the building. The trap was set, and all I had to do was wait for them to walk into it. The beauty of corporate incompetence is that it leaves a massive, clear paper trail. Arrogant people assume that because they do not care about details, nobody else does either. Gerald Thorne was the perfect example of this rule. While he believed I was documenting legacy code, I was actually exploring the company's sales folder, utilizing the administrative access they had forgotten to revoke. That was when I discovered a project folder labeled Project Titan. It was a signed contract with the largest retail conglomerate in North America, a deal worth $200 million. The retail client was known for being extremely strict about their contracts, possessing an army of aggressive lawyers who would immediately terminate any partnership if they discovered a vendor had engaged in fraud or misrepresentation. The conglomerate had recently acquired several smaller technology firms and was notorious for suing vendors who failed to deliver on intellectual property promises. The pilot launch was scheduled to begin in 3 weeks. I read the technical specifications promised to the client. It was all my code. They were white-labeling my predictive commerce engine and selling it as their own stand-alone product to a third party. I checked the intellectual property clauses in the Project Titan contract. OmniStream Technologies had legally guaranteed the client that the company possessed full, exclusive, and unencumbered ownership of all underlying technology. It was a massive multi-million-dollar lie. If I withdrew the license, the company would not only lose the client, but they would also be sued for fraud and breach of contract. The legal damages would ruin them completely. I spent the weekend running code comparisons between the original files I wrote in my basement and the files currently running on the Project Titan servers. It was a 98% match. They had not even changed the variable names. I found comments I had written 8 years ago, including jokes about my cat and reminders to buy milk, still sitting in the source code of their advanced neural network. I had even named the primary data processing loop, feed the cat, as a humorous reminder. Gerald's new architecture was nothing but a cheap, colorful wrapper slapped on top of my engine. I contacted an intellectual property lawyer I knew from my university days, a brilliant strategist named Eleanor Vance. We shared the same surname because she was my wife, and she knew exactly how greedy founders operated. We met at a quiet diner far away from the technology district, sitting in a corner booth where we could speak freely. I slid the document folder across the table and asked her to read the lease and the Project Titan contract. She read them carefully, her eyes widening as she scanned the signatures, and then she began to laugh. She told me this was not just a legal case but an execution. She explained that under Delaware corporate law and state statutes, intellectual property created prior to incorporation must be explicitly assigned via a separate document. Since Gavin had signed a lease instead of an assignment and then failed to renew it, I owned the entire foundation of their billion-dollar company, and they had simply forgotten to pay the rent. She advised me to remain silent and let them dig their hole deeper. She told me to let them launch the pilot program and open the new funding round. The more they relied on my intellectual property, the more leverage I would hold when the trap snapped shut. I returned to the office on Monday morning with a light step. Gerald Thorne stopped by my desk, asking about the progress of the documentation and mentioning that they would need to remove my server access soon. I smiled and told him I was just ensuring that every line of code was properly documented to prevent any confusion later. He nodded and asked if I could fix a latency issue on the Project Titan server. I told him that sounded like a task for his new engineers and their modern architecture. He frowned and walked away. I put my headphones on and returned to my work. The latency issue was not a bug. I had intentionally throttled the database performance by 5%. It was a small, satisfying tug on the leash, a quiet reminder of who actually controlled the core system. I watched Gerald from across the room. He was pacing around his glass office, talking on his phone, and looking increasingly stressed. The pilot program was under pressure, and the new team of developers was struggling to understand the system architecture. They did not know that the system was throttled because they did not understand the underlying database configurations. I felt a sense of satisfaction. I was not being malicious. I was simply exercising my rights. The company had chosen to treat me as disposable, and now they were going to learn that some things cannot be replaced. Eleanor had advised me to keep my emotions out of it and focus on the numbers. The numbers were entirely on my side, and they were growing larger every day. The corporate betrayal became personal on Wednesday afternoon. I was in the break room making a cup of coffee when Nolan Brooks, a junior developer fresh out of university, walked in. Nolan was a bright young man who actually wanted to learn how the database worked, unlike the other new hires who simply copied code from the internet. He looked around nervously to ensure we were alone before asking if he could show me something strange on his phone. He opened a Git repository screen and showed me a commit. Gerald Thorne had presented the core prediction module to the team that morning, claiming he had written the base logic himself during a weekend hackathon. Nolan had checked the repository timestamps and recognized my unique coding style. He noticed that Gerald had simply renamed the variables, changing user velocity to customer journey speed, and claimed credit for the entire system with a commit message, stating that he had refactored inefficient legacy logic for scalability. My blood ran cold, and then it turned to ice. Gerald was not just pushing me out of the company. He was stealing my life's work and claiming authorship in front of the entire engineering staff to justify his own salary. I thanked Nolan for his honesty, advising him to keep his head down, protect himself, and say nothing to anyone because the company was sailing into a massive storm. Nolan looked worried, asking me if he should start looking for another job. I reassured him that talented developers who cared about details would always find opportunities, but that he should not tie his career to a sinking ship. I went back to my desk and messaged Eleanor Vance. The fraud was now documented and confirmed. She replied immediately, telling me that the timing was perfect. The company was preparing for their Series D funding round, which would open the following week. The venture capitalists from Sand Hill Road were conducting their final due diligence. They would send a formal questionnaire asking if the company owned 100% of its intellectual property. Gavin Fletcher and Gerald Thorne would undoubtedly answer yes. To admit otherwise would kill the $50 million investment. I spent the next 3 days preparing my response. I did not delete the code, but I ran a custom script that removed all comments explaining how it operated. I obfuscated the variable names in the active repository, turning the clear logic into an impenetrable black box of hexadecimal strings. If they wanted to run the engine without me, they would have to guess how the gears turned. If anyone tried to modify a single line, the entire system would crash because the dependencies were mathematically linked. I saw the board meeting invitation appear on the shared digital calendar before it was quickly hidden. It was a closed session to finalize the funding round and approve the restructuring plan. I knew the plan involved firing me the moment the investment cleared. I did not wait for an invitation. As a founding shareholder, I had a statutory right to attend meetings regarding corporate assets. I printed a formal notice of an intellectual property audit and handed it to Gavin's assistant. Gavin Fletcher came running to my desk 10 minutes later, red-faced and furious. He demanded to know why I was trying to clutter the boardroom during a critical transaction. He paced around my small desk, adjusting his expensive shirt collar, his voice cracking with anxiety. He claimed that we had a shared dream and that my technical details would only confuse the investors. He tried to appeal to my loyalty, reminding me of the early days when we shared cold pizza in the basement. I listened quietly, realizing that his concept of family only applied when he wanted something for free. I told him calmly that the investors' lawyers were raising questions about the origin of the founding code and that it would be cleaner if I was present to confirm everything was in order. He paused, his greed making him blind to the trap. He believed I was offering to help him satisfy the investors so he could get his check and keep the dream alive. He agreed to give me 5 minutes at the start of the meeting to confirm the technology was proprietary and stable, warning me not to discuss any technical details. I agreed and went home to print my presentation slides. I spent the weekend rehearsing the presentation with Eleanor. She played the role of the hostile venture capitalists and the corporate lawyers, grilling me and trying to find weaknesses in my position. She pretended to be Stephen, the company's lawyer, challenging the timeline of the source code development. We went over the contract terms again and again, making sure we had an answer for every possible corporate defense. The lease agreement was clear and unambiguous. The intellectual property belonged to me, and the company had failed to maintain the lease. We knew that the corporate lawyers would try to argue that the code was created during my employment, but the timestamps and the incorporation dates proved otherwise. I felt ready. This was the moment I had been preparing for over 8 years. I was going to show them that you cannot simply discard the people who built the foundation of your entire business. The boardroom had a magnificent view of the river, and the mahogany table was large enough to host a small banquet. Around it sat the board of directors, Gavin Fletcher, Gerald Thorne, 2 venture capital partners from Sand Hill Road, and their corporate attorney, a man named Stephen. When I walked in, nobody offered me a hand or a seat. Gavin pointed to a chair in the corner and told the investors I was the legacy engineer here to sign off on the intellectual property details. One of the venture capital partners looked at me and asked if the company owned the entire software stack. Gavin nodded quickly, claiming it was completely proprietary. I stood up, walked to the head of the mahogany table, and announced that the statement was incorrect. The room fell into absolute silence. I plugged my laptop into the display screen and showed my first slide, which was the original intellectual property lease agreement from 8 years ago. I explained that I retained full ownership of the algorithm and had been leasing it to OmniStream Technologies for $1 a year. I showed the second slide, which documented their failure to renew the lease or pay the fee by the October deadline, meaning the agreement had officially terminated. Stephen, the corporate attorney, looked up from his computer, his face turning pale. He asked Gavin if he had signed the document. Gavin stammered, claiming he signed hundreds of papers, and that it did not matter because I was an employee. I pointed out that the lease agreement predated my employment contract, making the code excluded property licensed back to the company. The venture capital partners looked at Stephen, who was frantically scrolling through files. He admitted that the document was valid, meaning the company did not own the core technology. I showed the third slide, which detailed the unauthorized usage of my technology in Project Titan. I explained that they were deploying unlicensed software to their largest client and that the contract they signed was fraudulent. I told the board that a single phone call to the client's legal department would end the deal and result in a massive lawsuit. One of the board members turned to Gavin, demanding to know how this oversight had occurred, pointing out that the directors were now personally exposed to liability. Gavin screamed that I was just a programmer who did not understand business, but the venture capitalists ignored him. They asked their lawyer if my claim was valid. Stephen admitted that if the lease was genuine and had expired, the company did not own the core technology. The venture capitalists turned their cold looks toward Gavin. He was no longer a visionary founder. He was a liability who had jeopardized a $50 million deal. The investors asked what I wanted. I slid a new agreement across the table, drafted by Eleanor Vance. The contract established a new company, Vance Logic LLC, which would receive 15% of all gross revenue generated by the predictive engine, including the Project Titan contract. I also demanded the immediate termination of Gerald Thorne. Gavin tried to fight, but the venture capitalists forced him to sign the papers. They could not let the company collapse over a founder's pride. Within an hour, Gerald was escorted from the building, and Gavin was stripped of his operational authority, remaining only as a figurehead. I packed my hard drive and walked out of the building. I did not need to return. I was now their largest creditor, receiving a percentage of every sale they made while they handled all the administrative headaches. I went home, poured a glass of excellent scotch, and sat down to code for myself. I had proven that if you control the power grid, you can turn off the sun. I watched the sunset from my porch, feeling the weight of the last 8 years lift from my shoulders. The money was substantial, but the satisfaction of holding them accountable was worth far more. They had treated me as furniture, but, in the end, they were the ones who had to pay the rent. I knew that the company would survive, but it would never be the same. The balance of power had shifted, and I was finally in control of my own destiny. I looked at the contract on my table, signed by Gavin Fletcher in the presence of the board. It was a document of my victory, a reminder that the quiet programmer in the cardigan had outmaneuvered the unicorn founder. I took the first licensing check to the bank. The teller looked at the amount, her eyes widening in disbelief, and asked me what I did for a living. I told her I was in real estate. She smiled and asked if I sold houses. I told her no, I simply rented out logic to people who did not have any. I went home, poured another glass of scotch, and opened my laptop. I had a new idea for a predictive model that could detect corporate financial discrepancies. I thought Gavin Fletcher might be my very first client. I smiled as I began to write the first line of code, looking forward to a long retirement of writing software for my own enjoyment, surrounded by the quiet trees and the peace of a life lived on my own terms.